Look at this incredibly cheap fake. My father Marcus smirked while passing my sleek matte black business card across the linen tablecloth to his senior partners. Chief Technology Officer. He let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed through the exclusive steakhouse. It is hilarious what kids print off the internet these days. I sat there holding my water glass, feeling the familiar sting of his public humiliation. But this time, I did not shrink. This time, I smiled. Because my father had no idea that the little IT startup he was mocking was actually the parent company of his firm's biggest client. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I dismantled his entire career before dessert was even served. We were at Prime, cut a ridiculously overpriced restaurant in downtown Atlanta. My father had summoned the family and a few of his senior partners to celebrate my brother-in-law Chad getting a promotion. Chad is married to my younger sister Chloe. I had shown up out of pure obligation, thinking I could quietly survive 2 hours of small talk and fake smiles. I made the ultimate mistake of handing my new business card to my father when he loudly asked what I was doing for work these days. Chad swirled the expensive scotch in his glass, looking at me with that condescending expression he always wore when addressing me. You know, Maya, if your little IT startup needs help setting up printers or installing basic antivirus software, my firm has some summer interns who handle that sort of basic stuff. I could put in a good word for you. You do not want to be out there calling yourself a chief technology officer until you actually have a real tangible business. It is a bit misleading to the public, do you not think? Chloe chimed in right on cue, exactly as she always did. She reached over and patted my hand with fake sympathy. Oh, let her have her little fantasy, Chad. It has been incredibly hard for Maya ever since she dropped out of her master's program. We all know academics were never really her strong suit anyway. It is sweet that she is trying to play executive with her computer projects. Maybe one day she will get a real corporate job like the rest of us and stop worrying mom and dad. The senior partners chuckled politely at her cruel jab. My mother sat quietly at the end of the long table sipping her expensive red wine, enabling the emotional abuse through her complete silence, just as she had done my entire life. In all of their eyes, I was still just the family scapegoat. I was the miserable failure who walked away from a prestigious university to tinker with coding and software. They worshipped fancy corporate titles and expensive country club memberships. They had absolutely no idea that the tech company I co-founded, Apex Tech, was currently valued at over $1 billion. And they certainly did not know that Apex Tech had recently acquired the massive global holding company that single-handedly provided Martinez law firm with 40% of its annual revenue. I looked directly at Chad. His face was flushed with alcohol and unearned confidence. I looked at my younger sister, who was busy adjusting her diamond necklace, a lavish gift bought entirely with my father's money. Finally, I looked at my father. He was still holding my business card, passing it carelessly between his fingers, like a piece of worthless trash. He tossed it back onto the table, right next to my empty plate. "Playtime is over, Maya," he said in his deep, authoritative courtroom voice. "Stop embarrassing this family with these fake fabricated titles and go find a stable job that pays the bills." I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or try to explain my complex algorithms or my board of directors. I simply reached into my designer purse and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. I placed it neatly under my water glass to cover the cost of my salad and my drink. Then I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored custom suit. "Leaving so soon?" Chad mocked, feigning deep disappointment. "We have not even ordered the steaks yet." I looked down at him and offered a sweet, entirely empty smile. "Enjoy the meal," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "It might be your last one on the firm's dime." My father rolled his eyes, dismissing me completely as I turned and walked away. The sharp sound of my heels clicked against the polished hardwood floor of the restaurant. I did not look back even once. I stepped out into the cool evening air and walked calmly toward the valet stand. The valet brought around my car a brand new luxury sedan that cost more than Chad's entire annual salary. I slid into the driver's seat, closing the heavy door, shutting out the noise of the city. I pulled out my phone and opened my encrypted work email. I composed a new message to my lead corporate attorney. The subject line read, Martinez Law Firm. The body of the email contained only 2 sentences. Drop Martinez Law Firm immediately. Terminate all retainers and cancel their building access by morning. I hit send. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot. I knew that in exactly 15 minutes my father's phone would start ringing frantically. His managing partner would be calling to scream that their biggest client had just walked away. And my father would have absolutely no idea that his failure of a daughter was the exact person holding the scissors. I drove through the city streets, letting the quiet hum of the engine calm my nerves. The neon lights reflected off the polished hood of my car, creating a stark contrast to the dark, heavy atmosphere I had just left behind inside that restaurant. For 3 long years, Martinez Law Firm had been collecting massive retainer fees from a corporate entity called Vanguard Solutions. Vanguard Solutions was just a shell limited liability company. It was a perfectly legal corporate umbrella created specifically to handle the less glamorous administrative contracts and property acquisitions for my actual enterprise, Apex Tech. My father was a senior partner at that firm, but he never bothered to look past the corporate veil. He never looked at the names on the parent company documents. He never realized that the checks funding his lavish lifestyle, his expensive country club memberships, and Chad's completely unearned promotion were signed by the very daughter he loved to humiliate in public. My phone buzzed against the leather center console. It was an incoming call from David, my lead corporate attorney. I pressed a button on the steering wheel to route the call through the car audio system. "It is done, Maya," David said, his voice tight with professional efficiency. "I just got off the phone with Richard Vance, the managing partner at Martinez Law Firm. I officially informed him that Vanguard Solutions is terminating all active retainers, effective immediately, due to a sudden shift in our corporate security protocols." "How did he take the news?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. "He completely lost his mind." David chuckled softly, a sound of pure satisfaction. "You are their biggest whale, Maya. Vanguard accounts for nearly 40% of their annual billable hours." Richard was screaming so loudly I had to hold the receiver away from my ear. He was begging for a grace period, demanding to know if one of his partners had offended us, or if there was a discrepancy in the billing we needed to review. I told him the decision came straight from the top executive board and was entirely non-negotiable. I also instructed him to cease all legal activities on our behalf by midnight. I smiled, gripping the steering wheel. "Thank you, David. Freeze their building access passes by tomorrow morning and route any further communication straight to our litigation department. I do not want anyone from that firm reaching out to our core team." While I was pulling into the secure underground parking garage of my luxury high-rise building, absolute chaos was erupting back at the steakhouse. I would find out the specific details later from a paralegal friend who worked at the firm, but the scene played out exactly as I had predicted. The waiter had just brought out the massive dry-aged steaks and poured a fresh bottle of wine when my father's cell phone began vibrating frantically against the white tablecloth. He ignored the first 2 calls, assuming it was just a junior associate needing permission to leave the office early. But when the caller ID flashed the name of his managing partner for the 3rd time, he finally answered it. According to the grapevine, my father went completely pale. His booming, confident voice vanished instantly. He stood up abruptly, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward, and walked out onto the restaurant patio. Richard Vance tore into him. He demanded to know how the firm had just lost its biggest cash cow in the middle of a Thursday evening. My father, of course, had no answers. He paced back and forth, completely bewildered, stammering about market fluctuations and sudden corporate restructuring. He tried to soothe his furious boss. He insisted it must be a clerical error or a temporary pause in billing. He promised he would get to the bottom of it first thing in the morning and secure the account. He returned to the table a sweaty, nervous wreck. The celebratory mood was instantly dead. Chad, who had just been bragging loudly about his new corner office, suddenly looked terrified. Chloe stopped fussing with her diamond necklace. They boxed up their expensive meals in complete silence. My father was so obsessed with his own panic that the thought never even crossed his mind. He never once connected the exact timing of my departure with the catastrophic phone call he received minutes later. To him, I was still just the college dropout who fixed computers. I was incapable of wielding that kind of corporate power. I slept better that night than I had in years. I woke up the next morning feeling incredibly light and focused. I went for a run along the river, showered, and poured myself a cup of black coffee. I sat down at my kitchen island and opened my laptop to review the market reports. Apex Tech was up 3 points, and we were preparing to announce a massive new acquisition by the end of the quarter. Life was perfect. Then my personal cell phone rang. It was my mother. I stared at the screen, watching her name flash. I rarely answered her calls because they were usually just thinly veiled attempts to ask for money or to complain about how I never visited the family. But today was different. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, my phone pinged with a new audio message. I tapped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. My mother's voice filled the quiet kitchen. She was not using her usual passive-aggressive tone. She was crying. It was a frantic, hysterical sob that made my stomach tighten on pure instinct. "Maya, you need to call me back right now," she pleaded loudly into the receiver. "Your father is in terrible trouble at work. He lost a massive client last night, and his entire career is in serious jeopardy. We are having a mandatory family dinner this Sunday to discuss how we are going to survive this sudden crisis. Do not be selfish for once in your life. Your family desperately needs your help right now, Maya." The voicemail clicked off, leaving a heavy silence in my apartment. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark, bitter liquid slide down my throat. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, taking in the sweeping view of the city skyline. They wanted me to come to Sunday dinner. They wanted the family scapegoat to sit at the table and absorb their stress while they scrambled to save a career I had just destroyed. I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter. I had spent my entire life dreading Sunday dinners at that house. But this time, I was actually looking forward to it. I parked my car in the long driveway behind Chad's sports car. Usually Sunday dinners here meant the overwhelming aroma of roasted chicken hitting you the second you opened the door. But today, when I stepped into the foyer, there was no smell of food. The house was completely silent. I walked past the formal dining room. The long table was empty. "They are in the living room, Maya," my mother called out from the hallway. She stepped out of the shadows, wringing her hands. She looked exhausted, wearing a simple silk blouse. "Hurry up," she whispered nervously. "Your father has been pacing all afternoon." I followed her into the sunken living room. It looked like a corporate war room. My father stood by the marble fireplace, his tie loosened. Chloe and Chad sat on the white sofa surrounded by stacks of folders and spreadsheets. Nobody said hello. "Sit down, Maya," my father commanded, pointing to an armchair across from them. He did not even look at me properly. He was too busy shuffling papers. I remained standing and folded my arms. "What is all of this?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "I thought we were having dinner." "Nobody has time to eat, Maya," my father snapped. He marched over to the coffee table and slammed a thick file down in front of me. "We are facing an absolute catastrophe. Martinez Law Firm just lost our biggest client. Vanguard Solutions pulled their entire account Thursday night with zero warning. That account was my responsibility. If I do not fix this by tomorrow, Richard Vance will force me into early retirement." I looked down at the file. It had the Vanguard Solutions logo printed across the top. My logo. I had designed it myself 3 years ago on a napkin. It took every ounce of self-control not to smile. That sounds like a serious corporate issue, Dad, I said smoothly. But what exactly does this have to do with me? Chad let out a loud, exasperated sigh, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. We need your computer skills, Maya. Vanguard operates behind a massive wall of digital security and shell corporations. We have spent 48 hours trying to figure out who actually owns the company so Marcus can appeal directly to the chief executive officer. But their firewall is locked down. We cannot find a single name. My father pointed a thick finger at me. That is where you come in. You spend all day messing around with codes and servers. I want you to hack into the Vanguard database, find the internal executive directory, give me the cell phone number of whoever is running that company. I stared at him. The sheer audacity of his request was staggering. He spent his entire life mocking my career, calling me a keyboard mechanic. And now he wanted me to commit a federal cybercrime just to save his fragile ego. Are you seriously asking me to illegally breach the servers of a multi-billion-dollar corporation? I asked, raising one eyebrow. That is a federal offense. I could go to prison. Chloe rolled her eyes, letting out a dramatic scoff. Oh, please, Maya, do not be so dramatic. You are making it sound like some big heist. You are just poking around a website. It is not like you are a real tech executive with a reputation to protect. Nobody cares about your little startup. Just type some code and get the names. Dad needs this. I am not doing it, I said firmly. My voice was steady and devoid of emotion. I am not risking my freedom because you lost a client. Find another way to save your job. My mother gasped. She rushed forward, grabbing my arm with her cold hands. Maya, how can you say that? Your father's pension is on the line here. Everything we have built is at risk. Stop being so stubborn and selfish. Be a team player for once in your life like your sister. Chloe has been working all weekend trying to help your father draft legal appeals. The least you can do is use your computer tricks to help your family. I pulled my arm out of her grasp. I took a step back, creating a clear physical boundary. I am not being selfish, Mom, I replied coldly. I am being smart. You are asking me to break the law. The answer is no. Now, if there is no dinner, I am going home. I turned around, heading toward the grand foyer. I had barely taken 2 steps when I heard the heavy thud of Chad's leather shoes hitting the hardwood floor. He was moving fast. Before I could reach the front door, Chad stepped directly into my path, blocking my exit. He stood entirely too close, invading my personal space. His face was flushed red with anger, and his jaw clenched tight. He looked down at me, trying to use his height to intimidate me, just like he did to the junior associates. You are not walking out that door, Maya, Chad hissed, his voice dropping to a low, threatening whisper. You think you can just turn your back on this family when we need you. Let me explain how the real world works. You run some tiny, undocumented tech shop out of a rented office. I am a corporate lawyer with serious connections at the Internal Revenue Service. If you do not sit down right now and get us those Vanguard files, I will make one phone call. I will have your little IT company audited so thoroughly, they will seize every laptop and freeze every bank account you have. I will ruin you. I looked directly up into his angry, arrogant eyes. He really thought he had me cornered. He truly thought I was helpless. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. I did not flinch. I did not back away. Instead, I calmly walked over to the heavy oak coffee table and perched on the edge of it, directly facing him. I crossed my legs and looked up at Chad, waiting for him to continue. Chad took my silence as submission. He stepped even closer, tapping his index finger aggressively against the polished wood surface of the table. He puffed out his chest, trying to physically dominate the space. Let me break this down for you in terms someone without a law degree can understand. He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. If you refuse to comply with a direct familial request to assist in a corporate emergency, I have the power to file a petition for an injunctive seizure of your business assets. We call it piercing the corporate veil under Federal Statute 404. I know judges, Maya. I play golf with men who can sign a warrant to confiscate every server, every hard drive, and every bank account in your little rented office before you even finish your morning coffee. You are playing with fire, and I will gladly burn your little IT company to the ground. I stared at him for a long moment, letting the sheer stupidity of his words hang in the silent living room. I looked over at my father, who was nodding along in agreement, proudly watching his son-in-law threaten me. I looked at my mother, who was nervously twisting her wedding ring, completely fine with her daughter being bullied. Then I laughed. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a genuine deep belly laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of my parents' expensive house. My father slammed his hand against the marble mantel, demanding to know what was so funny. My mother gasped at my blatant disrespect. I stood up slowly, smoothing the invisible crease in my tailored trousers. I am laughing because you are a senior associate at a prestigious corporate law firm, and you just invented a federal statute out of thin air, I replied, my tone shifting from amused to absolute ice. Federal Statute 404 does not exist, Chad. You are loosely describing the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which has absolutely nothing to do with injunctive seizures of private, unrelated tech businesses. Furthermore, you cannot pierce the corporate veil of a limited liability company unless you can prove the deliberate commingling of personal and business funds or active ongoing fraud, neither of which applies to my company. You are stringing big legal words together to sound intimidating, but to anyone who actually understands corporate law, you sound completely incompetent. Chad blinked, taking a physical step backward. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He was not used to being challenged, let alone publicly educated on the law by a black woman he considered entirely beneath him. He relied on his height, his suits, and his unearned title to bully people into submission. My father looked at Chad, expecting him to fire back with a brilliant legal rebuttal to put me in my place, but Chad just stood there, his face turning a blotchy, uncomfortable shade of crimson. Since we are on the topic of corporate fraud, I continued pacing slowly across the expensive Persian rug. Let us talk about your missing client. Vanguard Solutions is a billion-dollar entity. Companies of that magnitude do not just terminate a contract representing 40% of a law firm's revenue overnight simply because of random market fluctuations or a bad mood. They do it because they run routine internal cybersecurity audits. I stopped pacing and locked eyes directly with Chad. They do it because their proprietary software tracks every single keystroke, every email sent, and every secure server login. They terminate contracts immediately when they discover that the billable hours submitted by their outside counsel do not mathematically match the actual login data on the secure client portals. They drop firms without warning when they realize a specific senior associate has been deliberately overbilling them for thousands of hours of legal work that was never actually performed. The color drained from Chad's face so fast, he looked physically ill. The arrogant, sneering mask vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. His breathing grew shallow and his eyes darted nervously toward my father, who was still too absorbed in his own impending ruin to notice Chad's sudden physical collapse. Chad knew exactly what he had been doing with those escrow accounts. He knew he had been faking his hours. And suddenly the tech girl he had been mocking all night just handed him his exact method of execution. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly. "What are you even talking about?" Chloe shrieked, shattering the tense silence in the room. She jumped up from the white sofa and stepped aggressively between me and her husband, throwing her arms out to shield him. She glared at me with pure venomous hatred. "How dare you come into our parents' house and speak to Chad that way? He is a brilliant attorney. He has 2 degrees. You are a college dropout who fixes broken hard drives for a living. You know absolutely nothing about corporate law, and you know nothing about his work." My sister was trembling with rage. She could not stand the sight of her perfect white husband being humiliated by the family disappointment. She had built her entire identity around being the golden child who married the successful lawyer. "You are just jealous, Maya," she spat. "You have always been jealous of my success and my marriage. You are making up ridiculous conspiracy theories to deflect from the fact that you are too stupid and too stubborn to help your own father save his job." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger inches from my face, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life. If you will not help us willingly, we will force you. I promise you, Maya, I will personally make you pay for this insolence. I will drag your little fake company through the mud until you are begging us for a job. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, refusing to give her the reaction she desperately wanted. I looked at my furious sister, my terrified brother-in-law, and my oblivious parents who always chose them over me. We will see about that, I whispered. I turned on my heel and walked straight toward the front door. My mother called after me, her voice shrill and demanding, but I did not stop. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the cool evening air, letting it slam firmly shut behind me. I walked down the driveway to my luxury car, leaving them trapped in that toxic house with their own sinking ship. They thought they were the predators preparing to hunt down my small business. They did not realize they had just declared war on the very person who held the deed to their entire professional existence. The trap was set, and they were walking right into it. I spent my time in the gleaming glass high-rise that housed the headquarters of Apex Tech, ignoring the desperate voicemails from my mother. I assumed my father and Chad were scrambling to pack their offices. I severely underestimated their arrogance and their desperation to save face. On Wednesday afternoon, my assistant buzzed my intercom to let me know a courier was at the front desk, insisting on a personal delivery. I walked out to the reception area, where a bored man in a cheap suit handed me a manila envelope. You have been served, he mumbled before getting back onto the elevator. I carried the envelope back into my corner office, shutting the heavy glass door. I sat down and pulled out the legal documents. My father and Chad had actually done it. They filed a formal lawsuit against my original limited liability company, the one I started in my 20s before Apex Tech existed. The charge was breach of contract and tortious interference. It was a completely frivolous lawsuit, a desperate bullying tactic designed to terrify me into submission. They demanded I pay Martinez law firm $500,000 in damages for allegedly manipulating Vanguard Solutions into dropping their contract. They still had no idea that I owned Vanguard. They simply assumed I had hacked into their system and sabotaged their relationship with the client out of spite. They thought they could use the legal system to crush my tiny IT shop and force me to apologize. As I read through the fabricated claims, my personal cell phone began vibrating off the desk. It was a coordinated attack. My father had deployed the rest of the family to wage a psychological war against me. My mother had activated the entire network of aunts, uncles, and cousins. I watched the names flash across the screen. Aunt Shirley, Uncle Robert, Cousin Denise. I let them all go to voicemail, but my inbox quickly filled. I leaned back and played the first message on speakerphone. It was Aunt Shirley, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. Maya, I cannot believe what I am hearing, she scolded sharply. Your mother is sick with worry. How could you let a proud, successful black man like your father face financial ruin? He worked his entire life to provide for you, to put a roof over your head, and this is how you repay him. You refuse to help him when he needs it most, and now you are forcing him to take you to court. You are an absolute disgrace to this family. You need to drop your stubborn pride, call your father, beg for his forgiveness, and fix this mess. I deleted the message. The next one was from Uncle Robert, echoing the exact same toxic rhetoric. They weaponized family loyalty, demanding absolute obedience to the patriarch, regardless of how abusive he was. In their eyes, a daughter was supposed to sacrifice herself to protect the image of the men in the family. All that mattered was maintaining the illusion of a perfect family. I turned off my phone and tossed it into my drawer. I was done listening to their guilt trips. I picked up the legal documents and walked down the hall to the legal department. I walked straight into the office of David, my lead corporate counsel, and dropped the lawsuit onto his pristine glass desk. David picked up the papers, adjusting his glasses. He scanned the first page and let out a sharp bark of laughter. Are they out of their minds? David asked, looking up in disbelief. They are suing a defunct Shell LLC for tortious interference. They have zero proof, and this jurisdiction does not even support half of these claims. This is amateur hour, Maya. A first-year law student could get this dismissed in 10 minutes. I do not want it dismissed, David, I said, leaning my hands against his desk. I want it destroyed. And I want to destroy the men who filed it. I want you to initiate an aggressive internal audit of Martinez law firm. Use the Vanguard contract clause that allows us to review their billing practices for the last 3 years. I want to know exactly what my father and Chad were doing with our money. David smiled a predatory grin. Consider it done, he said, reaching for his phone. I left the legal department and headed back to the technology floor. I pulled my best engineers off their current projects and tasked them with digging into the encrypted data files we had legally retrieved from Martinez law firm. If Chad thought he could threaten me with an audit, he was about to learn what a real audit looked like. I spent the next 4 hours in a marathon strategy meeting putting my family drama out of my mind. I had a billion-dollar company to run. But right as the meeting was wrapping up, the heavy oak door to the boardroom flew open. Julian, my lead data analyst, burst into the room. He did not knock or apologize for interrupting. He was clutching a digital tablet so tightly his knuckles were turning white. His eyes were wide and he looked completely out of breath. Maya, he said, ignoring the other executives in the room, you need to come with me right now. I just cracked the encryption on the Martinez law firm escrow accounts. We cross-referenced the billable hours with the secure server login data just like you asked. I stood up, feeling the sudden shift in the energy of the room. What did you find, Julian? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady. He walked over and handed me the tablet. The screen displayed a complex web of offshore bank transfers and forged digital signatures. Maya, you need to see what your brother-in-law has been doing with the firm's escrow accounts, Julian whispered. Because he is not just overbilling, he is committing massive federal fraud. I took the tablet from Julian's shaking hands. The glowing screen illuminated the dark, polished wood of the boardroom table. I looked up at the other executives who were still packing their briefcases. I need the room, I said, my voice deadpan. Everyone out, except Julian. They filed out quickly, sensing the sudden drop in temperature. Once the heavy oak door clicked shut, I pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. Show me exactly what you found, I ordered. Julian pulled up a chair next to me and began swiping through the encrypted ledgers. It started about 2 years ago, he explained, pointing to a series of highlighted spreadsheets. I noticed a discrepancy in the login times on the Vanguard portal. Chad was logging out of the secure client server at 5 in the evening, but billing the firm for hours extending well past midnight. At first I thought it was just aggressive padding. Lawyers do it all the time, right? But then I cross-referenced the billing software with the firm escrow accounts. Look at the routing numbers. He tapped a folder labeled Offshore Disbursements. I stared at the screen as rows of wire transfers cascaded down the display. Chad had created a phantom vendor account buried deep within the Martinez law firm accounting system. He was siphoning the inflated billable hours, transferring the excess cash out of the escrow accounts and funneling it directly into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. The amounts were staggering. 10,000 here, 50,000 there. Over the course of 2 years, he had successfully embezzled nearly $2.5 million of Vanguard money. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. He is stealing our money, I whispered. The perfect white son-in-law, the brilliant corporate attorney, is a common thief. It gets worse, Julian said quietly. He pulled up the authorization forms for the wire transfers. In order to move funds out of a client escrow account at Martinez law firm, you need 2 signatures, the initiating associate and the overseeing senior partner. I leaned forward, staring at the digital signatures stamped at the bottom of every single fraudulent transfer. The first signature belonged to Chad. The second signature belonged to my father, Marcus. My blood ran cold. I stared at the sweeping loops of my father's handwriting. The man who had spent my entire life preaching about integrity discipline and the pristine reputation of his legal career had his name attached to a massive federal crime. I sat there in the quiet boardroom, trying to make sense of it. There were only two possible explanations. Either my father was completely negligent, blindly signing documents for his golden son-in-law without ever reviewing the financial data, or he was fully aware of the embezzlement and actively helping Chad steal millions of dollars from his biggest client. Knowing my father's massive ego and his desperate need to fund my mother's lavish lifestyle, I realized the truth was probably a toxic combination of both. He called my business card a cheap fake, I muttered to myself, feeling a bitter smile tug at the corners of my mouth. He sat in a high-end steakhouse and humiliated me for playing executive while his own career was built on stolen money and forged documents. "What do you want to do?" Maya Julian asked nervously. "Should we alert the authorities? We have enough evidence right here to send the FBI through their front doors by morning." I shook my head, turning off the tablet screen. "No," I replied firmly. "If we just hand this over to the feds, Martinez law firm will claim it was the action of a few rogue employees. They will fire Chad, force my father into quiet retirement, and sweep the institutional rot under the rug. My father and Chad just filed a frivolous lawsuit to publicly destroy my character. They want to play corporate warfare. I am going to show them what a hostile takeover actually looks like." I stood up, pacing the length of the boardroom. The lawsuit was no longer just an annoyance. It was the perfect Trojan horse. They were demanding a mediation session, assuming I would show up terrified and ready to settle. But I realized I could not just fight the lawsuit. I needed to destroy the corruption at its absolute root. I needed to buy the very ground they walked on. I told Julian to compile every single piece of evidence into a heavily encrypted hard drive. I needed the Cayman routing numbers, the login discrepancies, and the forged signatures cataloged and ready for presentation. I was going to let them walk into that mediation room thinking they held all the cards. And then I was going to drop an anvil on their heads. Julian nodded, grabbing his tablet. "I will have the final data packet encrypted and delivered to your private server by midnight," he said before hurrying out of the boardroom. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering city skyline. For the first time in my life, I did not feel the heavy weight of my family expectations. I did not feel the lingering sting of being the scapegoat. I felt powerful. I held the absolute destruction of their false reality in the palm of my hand. My father wanted a team player. He was about to find out that I owned the entire stadium. Just as I was turning away from the window, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting an update from David in the legal department. Instead, the screen lit up with an incoming text message from an unsaved number, but I knew exactly who it was. The message was short, demanding, and dripping with the usual entitlement. It read, "Maya, we need to talk before this gets any uglier. Meet me at the coffee shop on 5th Avenue in 1 hour. Come alone." It was Chloe. I grabbed my coat. I did not want to see my sister, but her timing was perfect. She was walking right into the crosshairs, and I wanted to see what desperate strategy she and Chad had cooked up. I told my assistant to clear my schedule and headed down to the lobby. The coffee shop on 5th Avenue was only a few blocks away. It was an overpriced boutique cafe where the city elite liked to pretend they were casual, everyday people. I walked through the heavy glass doors and spotted Chloe sitting in a corner booth. She was wearing a tailored designer blazer and oversized sunglasses, acting as if she were dodging paparazzi. She looked nervous, but tried desperately to hide it behind a wall of manufactured arrogance. I walked over and slid into the leather booth across from her. She did not take off her sunglasses or say hello. She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out a folded paper. She slid it across the polished wood surface toward me. I looked down without touching it. It was a cashier's check made out to me for $15,000. Next to the check, she placed a thick stack of stapled documents. The bold letters clearly labeled it as a non-disclosure agreement. I looked up, waiting for the inevitable pitch. I wanted to hear how she planned to insult my intelligence today. Take the money, Maya, she said, keeping her voice tight. It is more than your computer repair shop makes in a month. All you have to do is sign that paperwork. It states your LLC accidentally triggered a massive data breach on the Martinez law firm servers, causing the accounting discrepancies. You will publicly take the blame for the missing funds and state it was a software glitch. Chad will swoop in as the hero who discovered the glitch and saved the firm. The lawsuit gets dropped immediately, and everybody walks away fine. Your name gets bruised, but you get 15 grand. I stared at her in sheer disbelief. She was asking me to admit to corporate incompetence to cover up her husband's federal crimes. You cannot be serious, Chloe, I replied, keeping my voice steady. You want me to destroy my professional reputation to save a thief? She scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively. Oh, please, Maya, do not be so dramatic. What reputation are you talking about? I am the lawyer, Maya. I have an actual reputation to uphold. I am on the board of 3 charities, and my husband is about to make senior partner. You fix computers. You run a tiny startup nobody has ever heard of. No one cares if your name gets a little muddy. You can just start a new LLC. People expect tech companies to have bugs and glitches. A financial scandal like this would destroy Chad's career and ruin my social standing. You are single and have no legacy to protect. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. We are family, Maya. You owe us this. You have been a disappointment to our parents your entire life. This is your chance to finally do something useful. Take the money. Buy yourself new servers or whatever you geeks play with. Sign the paper and let us get back to our lives. She looked so smugly confident that I would just roll over and accept her scraps. She truly believed $15,000 was a life-changing amount of money for me. She had no idea she was sitting across from a billionaire who could buy the entire building. I did not argue with her. I did not try to explain that $15,000 was what my company spent on break room snacks every week. Instead, I reached out and picked up the cashier's check. I held it between my fingers, looking at the neatly printed numbers. Then I slowly, deliberately ripped the check perfectly in half. Chloe gasped, her jaw dropping open in shock as I tore the pieces again. I placed the torn confetti back onto the table. Then I picked up her meticulously drafted non-disclosure agreement and dropped it straight into the half-empty cup of black coffee sitting between us. The thick paper soaked up the dark liquid, instantly ruining the document. Are you insane? Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking. People at neighboring tables turned to look, but I did not care. I leaned across the table, closing the distance between us. Let me make this very clear for you, Chloe, I whispered, my voice cold and hard. I know exactly what Chad has been doing with those escrow accounts. I know about the offshore transfers to the Cayman Islands. I know about the forged signatures. Your husband is not a hero discovering a glitch. He is a criminal who embezzled $2.5 million. And you are an absolute fool if you think a $15,000 bribe stops a federal investigation. Chloe turned ashen. The smug entitlement vanished from her face, replaced by sheer panic. You do not know what you are talking about, she stammered, gripping the edge of the table. You are just making things up because you are jealous. No, Chloe. I am telling you the absolute truth, I replied, standing up and looking down at her. So you need to go home right now and tell your perfect white husband to pack a bag. Federal prison does not allow designer suits. And tell my father he might want to pack one too. Chloe completely lost her mind. She grabbed her large plastic cup of iced latte and hurled it directly at me. The cold brown liquid splashed across my silk blouse, soaking the expensive fabric. I will ruin you, Maya, she screamed, her face contorted with pure rage. I will make sure you never work in this city again. I calmly wiped my face and dialed Victor. Let us buy a law firm. Victor was my chief financial officer, and he never questioned my directives. When I told him to pull the full financial profiles on Global Holdings, he had the data on my desk before I even returned to the office. Global Holdings was a massive international conglomerate. They were the parent entity that owned the premium commercial real estate where Martinez law firm was located. More importantly, they held the master contracts for all the subsidiary legal networks operating under that corporate umbrella. They were the ultimate puppeteers, and my father was just a tiny, clueless puppet dancing happily on their strings. I scheduled an emergency executive meeting with Harrison, the chief executive officer of Global Holdings. Harrison was an old-school corporate titan who valued concrete numbers above absolutely everything else. He did not care about petty family drama or trivial office politics. He cared about maximizing profit margins, securing market dominance, and eliminating operational inefficiencies. That made him the absolute perfect target for my strategy. Early the next morning, I walked into the Global Holdings headquarters. The building was a towering monolith of sleek glass and dark steel dominating the city financial district. I rode the private VIP elevator up to the top floor and stepped into a sprawling executive suite overlooking the harbor. Harrison was waiting for me at a massive mahogany conference table. He was flanked by his top 3 financial advisors. They looked at me with a mixture of intense curiosity and professional respect. They knew exactly who I was. In the modern tech world, Apex Tech was an unstoppable force, and my name commanded immediate, unwavering attention. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Harrison," I said, taking a seat directly across from him. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I opened my sleek laptop and connected it to the massive digital screen at the front of the room. "I am here to make you an offer that will completely revolutionize your entire corporate structure and secure your legal data for the next decade." I projected a series of complex data models onto the screen. I explained that Global Holdings was bleeding millions in capital through outdated data management systems across their various legal subsidiaries. I showed them exactly how much money they were losing every single month due to inefficient billing software and incredibly vulnerable cybersecurity protocols. Harrison leaned forward, his eyes locked on the staggering numbers flashing across the screen. "Apex Tech is prepared to initiate a massive capital injection," I explained, my voice projecting absolute confidence. "We want to acquire your entire cybersecurity and data management sector. In addition, we will deploy our proprietary artificial intelligence algorithms across your entire legal network. Our software will optimize your firm operations track every single billable hour with absolute precision and eliminate any possibility of financial fraud or human error. We will increase your overall profit margins by 20% in the first fiscal year alone." One of the senior financial advisors scoffed, shaking his head. "That is a bold claim, Maya," he challenged. "Our current systems are standard across the legal industry. Changing the entire digital infrastructure of our law firms would be a logistical nightmare." I turned my gaze to him, locking eyes until he shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. "Standard does not mean secure," I replied smoothly. "Your standard systems allowed over $2 million to be funneled into offshore accounts from just one of your subsidiary branches in the last 2 years. I have the blockchain data to prove it. My algorithm catches those anomalies in real time. It is not a logistical nightmare. It is a necessary evolution to stop your employees from robbing you blind." The room fell dead silent. Harrison folded his hands, looking at me intensely. The advisor looked down at his notepad, completely defeated. "That is an incredibly aggressive and generous offer," Maya Harrison said slowly, digesting the magnitude of my proposal. "But Apex Tech does not just hand out billion-dollar algorithms out of the goodness of their hearts. What exactly do you want in return for this technological overhaul?" "I want full controlling interest over your legal subsidiaries," I stated flatly, refusing to blink. "That includes the physical real estate assets and the absolute operational oversight of Martinez Law Firm. I want the authority to restructure their executive board, to audit their accounts, and to terminate any personnel without requiring board approval from Global Holdings." Harrison raised an eyebrow. He was a brilliant man, and he likely sensed that there was a deeply personal motive hidden beneath this sudden corporate acquisition. But the raw numbers I presented were simply too lucrative to ignore. The digital optimization of their massive legal network would save his company tens of millions of dollars. Giving me absolute control over one specific law firm branch was a minuscule price to pay for the technological superiority Apex Tech was offering. "You drive a very hard bargain," Maya Harrison said, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. "But the data simply does not lie. If you can deliver the optimization you just promised, Martinez Law Firm is yours to do with as you please." We spent the next 6 hours locked in that boardroom drafting the massive acquisition paperwork. My elite legal team worked alongside his corporate lawyers, ironing out every specific operational detail. I made absolutely sure that the acquisition remained strictly confidential until the end of the current quarter. I did not want my father or Chad getting any advance warning about the shift in power. They needed to walk into that mediation room completely blind and utterly defenseless. By late afternoon, the final massive contracts were printed and signed. The ink dried, and the transfer of absolute power was officially complete. I walked out of the Global Holdings building feeling a profound sense of absolute victory. I was no longer just the scapegoat daughter they could easily discard. I was the landlord. I owned the expensive mahogany desks they sat at. I owned the secure servers they used. I owned the very walls that surrounded their pathetic egos. My father had spent his entire life worshipping corporate power, and now I held all of his power in the palm of my hand. I returned to my luxury penthouse just as the sun began to set over the sprawling city skyline. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and finally checked my personal cell phone. There was a new audio voicemail waiting for me. I pressed play, and the booming, arrogant voice of my father filled the quiet kitchen. "Maya, it is your father," he said, his tone dripping with condescending triumph and misplaced authority. "I heard you refused Chloe's very generous offer at the coffee shop today. That was a massive mistake. You always were too stubborn for your own good. Chad has spent the entire day preparing an airtight breach of contract case against your little company. We have the formal mediation session scheduled for tomorrow morning at my firm. Bring your cheap lawyers and bring your checkbook because we are going to crush you. I suggest you wear something respectful. Try not to embarrass me in front of my partners any more than you already have." The voicemail clicked off, leaving a heavy silence in the room. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the glittering city lights. My father was gloating. He truly thought he had me cornered. He thought I was a helpless victim walking into a corporate slaughterhouse. I took a slow sip of my water and smiled a cold, calculated smile. I was fully prepared to bring my lawyers, but they were not coming to defend me. They were coming to execute him. I arrived at the Apex Tech executive boardroom before the sun even fully crested over the horizon. The city was still bathed in the quiet gray light of early morning, but my team was already operating at maximum efficiency. My lead corporate counsel, David, was waiting for me alongside Julian, my lead data analyst. They had been up all night finalizing the exact sequence of our corporate execution. The massive mahogany table was covered in thick black binders instead of the usual digital tablets we used for presentations. I wanted physical paper for this specific encounter. I wanted my father and Chad to feel the actual physical weight of their own destruction in their hands. David slid the first heavy binder across the polished table toward me. "This is the official letter of acquisition," he stated, his voice crisp and strictly professional. "It includes the signed authorization from Harrison, detailing your full controlling interest over Global Holdings, and by direct extension, Martinez Law Firm." I opened the binder and reviewed the immaculate legal jargon printed on the heavy ivory paper. It was absolutely bulletproof. Julian pushed the second binder forward. "This one is the kill shot, Maya," he said, tapping the thick leather cover with his index finger. "It contains the complete encrypted blockchain ledger cross-referenced with Chad's fraudulent billing hours, and the offshore Cayman Islands accounts. We also included high-resolution scans of your father's forged authorization signatures, matching them perfectly against his verified firm records. David leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. I took the liberty of drafting the formal termination notices for both Marcus and Chad, he added smoothly. Furthermore, I have prepared the official grievance complaints to be filed immediately with the State Bar Association. The moment we present these documents, their legal careers are effectively over. They will be permanently disbarred, and the federal authorities will have a neatly packaged case for wire fraud and embezzlement. I nodded slowly, running my hand over the smooth covers of the binders. Everything was perfectly in place. The trap was locked tight. As David and Julian gathered the binders to carefully pack them into secure locking briefcases, my personal cell phone buzzed loudly on the table. The screen lit up, displaying my mother's name. I stared at the glowing letters for a long moment. Part of me, the small wounded child inside that still desperately craved maternal affection, hoped she was calling to apologize. I foolishly hoped she was calling to tell me she loved me and that this corporate warfare was tearing the family apart. I reached out and answered the call, putting it on speakerphone so the quiet boardroom could hear every word. Maya, her voice crackled through the speaker, sounding anxious and entirely superficial. I know you are coming to your father's office today for that mediation thing. I am only calling because I need to make sure you behave yourself. I sat back in my chair, saying absolutely nothing. My mother took my silence as an invitation to continue her toxic, enabling behavior. Please, Maya, she pleaded, her tone dripping with condescension and embarrassment. Do not wear one of those casual tech outfits you always wear. Put on a nice dress. Comb your hair properly. Your father is going to be sitting in a room with the white senior partners of his firm, and the last thing he needs is his dropout daughter embarrassing him by looking like a street mechanic. Just apologize to Chad, sign whatever papers they give you, and leave quietly. Do not cause a scene, Maya. We have already suffered enough because of your selfish stubbornness. David and Julian stared at the phone in absolute stunned silence. They were highly paid corporate executives who witnessed my brilliance and power every single day. Hearing my own mother speak to me as if I were a rebellious, incompetent child left them completely speechless. I looked at the phone and felt a profound, permanent shift deep within my chest. It was a physical sensation, like a heavy rusted chain finally snapping in half and falling away. For 33 years, I had carried the heavy burden of trying to win their approval. I had accepted the insults, the dismissals, and the blatant disrespect because I believed that blood demanded loyalty. I thought that if I just became successful enough, if I just proved my worth, they would finally see me as an equal. But hearing my mother prioritize the fragile ego of her corrupt husband and the comfort of his racist white partners over her own innocent daughter finally cured me. The last remaining spark of hope I held for my family was permanently extinguished right there in the boardroom. The warm, beating heart of a devoted daughter turned completely to ice. I did not feel sad. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly light and dangerously focused. I was completely free from their emotional manipulation. I hear you, Mom, I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. I promise you, I will wear something very respectful. I reached forward and ended the call. I turned off the phone entirely and slid it across the table. I looked at David, who was watching me with a mixture of deep sympathy and intense respect. Let us go, I commanded, standing up from the table. It is time to mediate. I took the private elevator down to the secure parking garage and drove straight back to my penthouse. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and bypassed the casual slacks and silk blouses I usually wore to the office. Today required actual armor. I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a custom-tailored power suit. It was a flawless, deep charcoal gray with razor-sharp lapels and a structured silhouette that demanded absolute authority. It cost over $5,000, and I had never worn it before. I paired it with a crisp white silk shirt and a pair of black stiletto heels that echoed like gunshots against the hardwood floor. I pulled my hair back into a tight, sleek bun, leaving nothing out of place. I looked in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at me was no longer the family scapegoat. She was a titan of industry about to burn an empire to the ground. I grabbed my designer handbag, stepped out of my luxury penthouse, and headed out the door ready for war. I pulled into the VIP garage of Martinez law firm. The attendant quickly scrambled to open my door, taking my keys with a respectful nod. I walked across the polished marble floor of the expansive lobby, my heels clicking with a rhythmic purpose. The morning sun poured through the massive atrium windows, casting long shadows across the lobby floor. I approached the reception desk, where a young woman with a tight blonde bun looked up from her computer monitor. She looked me up and down, taking in my presence, but clearly missing the authority in my posture. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with practiced corporate politeness. "I am here for a mediation session in the main boardroom," I replied, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "My name is Maya." The receptionist tapped her keyboard a few times and let out a small dismissive sigh. Yes, the breach of contract mediation," she said, glancing at my tailored suit with a hint of jealousy. "You are the defendant. The main elevators are reserved for partners and registered corporate clients. You will need to take the service elevator around the corner to your left and sign in with the security guard on the 40th floor." She pointed toward a dimly lit hallway near the loading dock. I did not move. I did not argue. I simply reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a solid black metallic keycard. It was not a standard visitor pass. It was the Master Executive Access Card given only to the board members of Global Holdings. I tapped the heavy metal card against the security scanner sitting on her desk. The machine instantly chirped a high-pitched chime and the light flashed a brilliant solid green. The receptionist stared at the screen as her computer immediately flashed a top-tier security clearance override. Her condescending smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. "That is not necessary," I told her, sliding the card back into my bag. "I will be taking the executive elevator. Have a wonderful morning." I walked past her desk, ignoring her stammering apologies, and stepped into the private glass elevator. The elevator ascended 40 floors in seconds. I watched the city shrink beneath me, feeling completely detached from the family drama waiting above. The doors slid open silently, revealing the opulent reception area of Martinez law firm. The walls were paneled in rich dark mahogany, and the floors were lined with thick Persian carpets. Junior associates scurried down the hallways, clutching files, looking terrified and exhausted. I walked past them with absolute confidence. I knew the layout of this office perfectly because I had spent the last 24 hours analyzing its exact architectural blueprints. I turned the corner and walked down the main executive corridor, heading straight for the primary conference room. It was a massive corner room enclosed entirely in thick soundproof glass. Through the clear walls, I could see them waiting for me. My father Marcus sat near the middle of the long table, his suit jacket unbuttoned, looking incredibly smug. Chad was seated next to him, aggressively sorting through a massive stack of printed documents, clearly intending to use the sheer volume of paper to intimidate me. Chloe sat on the other side of Chad, filing her nails, acting as though she was completely bored by the impending destruction of her sister's life. They were laughing about something. My father slapped Chad on the shoulder, projecting the image of a proud patriarch admiring his brilliant son-in-law. They thought this was going to be a quick and effortless victory. They thought they were the apex predators waiting for a wounded lamb to wander into their trap. I pushed open the heavy glass door. The quiet hum of the climate control system was instantly replaced by the thick, heavy tension radiating from my family. The laughter died the moment I stepped into the room. Chloe stopped filing her nails and looked up, her eyes scanning my custom $5,000 suit. I could see the immediate flash of envy and confusion cross her face. She had expected me to show up in a cheap sweater, looking defeated and desperate. Chad puffed out his chest and forcefully tapped his massive stack of papers against the mahogany table, aligning the edges with exaggerated aggression. "Glad you could finally make it, Maya," Chad sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Have a seat right there so we can get this over with quickly. I have a very busy afternoon scheduled." He pointed his silver pen toward a small, uncomfortable wooden chair positioned alone on the far side of the table. It was the designated defendant chair deliberately placed lower than the other seats, to make whoever sat there feel physically inferior and completely isolated. My father leaned back in his plush leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with absolute disdain. "Let us skip the dramatic apologies, Maya," he commanded, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "You are going to sign the settlement agreement Chad drafted. You are going to admit fault for the software failure, and you are going to liquidate your assets to compensate this firm for the damages you caused." I did not walk toward the small wooden defendant chair. I ignored my father's demands and walked past them, my heels echoing against the hardwood floor. I moved directly to the head of the massive mahogany table. I placed my designer handbag down and pulled out the oversized high-back leather chair positioned at the very end. It was the seat strictly reserved for the managing partner of the firm. I sat down and crossed my legs smoothly. My father shot up out of his seat and slammed his heavy hand hard onto the table. "Get out of that chair!" he roared, his face turning bright red with fury. "You are here to surrender, you arrogant little dropout." I did not flinch when his voice echoed against the thick glass walls. I simply leaned back into the plush leather of the managing partner's chair, resting my hands on the polished armrests. "I am perfectly comfortable right here, Dad," I replied, my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. "If you want to start this mediation, you can present your terms to me from exactly where you are sitting." My father stood there for a moment, his chest heaving with indignation. He looked as if he wanted to physically drag me out of the seat, but the formal setting of the glass boardroom held him back. He shot a look at Chad, silently commanding his son-in-law to take control of the situation and put me in my place. Chad enthusiastically accepted the unspoken order. He stood up, puffing out his chest, and snapped his expensive leather briefcase open. He began pulling out thick stacks of paper, aggressively slapping them onto the mahogany table. "Let us get right down to business," Chad said, adopting his most condescending courtroom voice. He paced slowly behind his chair, deliberately trying to look like a seasoned trial lawyer, preparing to destroy a hostile witness. "You have committed tortious interference with a primary corporate contract. By manipulating Vanguard Solutions into terminating their retainers, you have caused Martinez Law Firm millions of dollars in projected revenue loss. We have drafted a comprehensive settlement agreement that requires the immediate liquidation of your personal and business assets." I sat perfectly still, letting him pace. I did not interrupt him. I did not bother pointing out that Vanguard Solutions dropped them because of his own criminal behavior. I did not tell him that tortious interference was completely impossible to prove since I was the one who owned the contract in the first place. I just let him talk. "We are demanding complete financial restitution." Chad continued, his voice growing louder and more confident with every unchallenged word. "You will sign over the deed to your apartment, the operating capital of your little tech startup, and any personal savings accounts you currently hold. If the total liquidated value does not cover the firm damages, we will place a permanent lien on your future earnings. If you refuse to sign these documents right now, we will immediately file a formal complaint with the federal court. We will freeze your accounts and drag you through years of litigation until you are completely bankrupt and begging for mercy on the street." He stopped pacing and leaned heavily on the table, staring down at me with a triumphant smirk. He truly believed he was brilliant. He thought his barrage of legal terminology was an unbreakable weapon. He had absolutely no idea that the very boardroom we were sitting in was equipped with a state-of-the-art hidden audio and visual recording system. The system had been installed by Global Holdings 2 years ago to monitor high-stakes corporate mediations, and I had personally reactivated it from my laptop during the car ride over. Every single extortion attempt, every threat, and every arrogant demand Chad made was currently being recorded, encoded, and uploaded directly to my private secure servers. Chloe shifted in her chair, clearly bored by the legal details. She pulled a crystal nail file from her designer handbag and began casually filing her perfectly manicured nails. You really should have just taken the money I offered you at the coffee shop, Maya. She sighed without bothering to look up from her hands. $15,000 was a very generous gift considering the absolute mess you caused for our family. But you just had to be stubborn. You always have to try and prove you are smarter than everyone else. Now look at you. You are going to lose your little computer business and end up with absolutely nothing. You brought this entirely on yourself by refusing to be a team player. I looked at my sister listening to the rhythmic scratching of her nail file. I watched her dismiss my entire life of hard work as a temporary inconvenience to her luxury lifestyle. I looked at Chad, who was sliding a silver pen across the table, demanding my immediate signature on his fabricated documents. Finally, I looked at my father. He was watching me with a cold, satisfied expression, entirely pleased with the prospect of his oldest daughter being financially ruined as long as it protected his fragile reputation and kept his pension intact. I glanced down at the sleek gold watch on my wrist. I had decided before I walked into this building to give them exactly 15 minutes to dig their own graves. I wanted the digital recording to capture the full, unadulterated extent of their arrogance and their malicious intent. I wanted the authorities to hear exactly how this family operated behind closed doors. I thought about all the holidays I had spent sitting quietly while they mocked my career choices. I thought about the endless comparisons to Chloe, the golden child who could do no wrong. I thought about the way my father had proudly paraded Chad around the country club, boasting about his brilliant legal mind while completely ignoring my massive achievements in the tech industry. All of those painful memories fueled my patience. I sat there watching them perform their pathetic little play, knowing that I was the director, the producer, and the sole owner of the entire theater. For 14 long minutes, I sat in absolute silence. I let them threaten me. I let them insult my intelligence. I let them paint a vivid picture of the poverty and public humiliation they planned to inflict upon me. Chad grew increasingly agitated by my silence, mistaking my calm demeanor for shock and submission. He began tapping his fingers aggressively against the table, demanding verbal confirmation that I understood the severity of my situation. "Sign the paper," Maya, my father, finally barked, losing his patience with the theatrics. "Stop wasting our valuable time and sign the damn settlement agreement so we can clean up your mess." I looked back down at my watch. The minute hand clicked precisely into place. The 15 minutes were officially up. They had provided more than enough recorded evidence to guarantee criminal convictions for extortion and blackmail, on top of the federal wire fraud they had already committed. The grave was officially dug, and it was finally time to push them in. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the room like a physical blade. I slowly picked up the silver pen Chad had provided and twirled it effortlessly between my fingers. "In fact, I am not here to mediate a single thing with any of you." Chad let out a loud, dramatic groan, throwing his hands up in the air in pure exasperation. "Are you completely delusional, Maya?" he shouted, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. "Do you not understand what is happening here? You do not have a choice in this matter. We hold all the power. We own this room. We own this firm. We own you." Before the echo of his arrogant words could even fade from the room, the heavy glass door of the boardroom swung violently open. The sudden movement caught all of us by surprise. My father turned his head, expecting to see a junior associate delivering coffee or maybe a paralegal dropping off extra copies of the settlement documents. But it was not a junior associate. It was Richard Vance, the managing partner of Martinez law firm. He stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, as if he had just sprinted down the entire length of the executive corridor. His usually immaculate tailored suit was severely rumpled, his tie was crooked, and his face was entirely drained of color. He stood frozen, holding the handle of the glass door, his eyes wide and frantic. He looked absolutely terrified. Richard Vance stood completely frozen, holding the heavy metal handle of the glass door. His eyes darted around the room before finally locking onto me, sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table. My father Marcus immediately snapped out of his blind rage. The moment he saw his managing partner enter the room, his entire demeanor completely shifted. The aggressive, dominating patriarch vanished and was instantly replaced by the subservient corporate employee, desperate to impress his boss. My father quickly buttoned his suit jacket, smoothed his silk tie, and marched toward the door with a wide, practiced smile plastered across his face. "Richard, it is great that you could drop in," my father said, extending his hand for a firm greeting. "You do not need to worry about the Vanguard Solutions situation anymore. Chad and I have everything completely under control. We are just wrapping up the final details of this nuisance lawsuit." The defendant was just about to sign the settlement agreement and hand over her company assets to cover the firm damages. Richard did not take my father's extended hand. He did not even look at him. Richard was breathing heavily, and a thin layer of sweat coated his pale forehead. He walked right past my father, leaving him standing awkwardly near the doorway, with his hands suspended in midair. Richard moved with a frantic, nervous energy that completely shattered the confident, professional atmosphere of the boardroom. He walked directly toward the head of the table, stopping a few feet away from the oversized leather chair I was occupying. Then Richard Vance, the managing partner of one of the most prestigious law firms in the city, did something that made my father physically gasp. Richard lowered his head in a deep, respectful bow. "Ms. Maya," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I sincerely apologize for the intrusion. We were not informed by the parent company that you would be visiting the building today. If the executive board had notified me of your arrival, I would have personally cleared the lobby and arranged a proper reception for you. I was just on an emergency conference call with Harrison from Global Holdings, and he informed me that you were conducting an unscheduled inspection of our facility. Please let me know whatever you need. My entire office is entirely at your disposal." The boardroom fell into absolute dead silence. The heavy, soundproof glass walls seemed to magnify the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. My father stumbled backward, slightly bumping into the edge of the conference table. His brain could not process the image of his incredibly powerful boss bowing to his scapegoat daughter. Chad broke the silence with a loud, obnoxious chuckle. He genuinely thought this was a joke. He assumed Richard was employing some bizarre psychological tactic to mock me before forcing me to sign the legal documents. Chad adjusted his expensive watch and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a smug grin. "That is a good one, Richard, sir." Chad laughed, pointing his silver pen in my direction. "But there is absolutely no need to be polite to this pest. We have her completely cornered. She is a college dropout running a pathetic little basement operation. She was just playing tough, but she knows she is entirely out of her league here. We are handling her right now. We will have her company assets fully liquidated and transferred to our firm escrow accounts by noon." Richard turned his head slowly to look at Chad. The raw terror in his eyes was instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated disgust. He looked at Chad as if he were staring at a disgusting insect that had crawled onto his immaculate boardroom table. "Shut your mouth, you complete idiot!" Richard snarled, his voice echoing off the glass walls. His face flushed bright red with sudden, explosive anger. "You arrogant, incompetent fool! Do you have any idea what you are doing? You are not extracting assets from a tiny basement startup. You are not threatening a college dropout." Richard pointed a trembling finger directly at me, keeping his eyes locked fiercely on Chad. "You are speaking to the new majority shareholder of Global Holdings. She is the founder and owner of Apex Tech. As of 8 o'clock this morning, she personally acquired the total controlling interest of our entire legal network. She owns the building you are standing in. She owns the contracts you manage. She is the absolute ultimate authority over Martinez law firm. We all work for her now." The silver pen slipped from Chad's fingers and clattered loudly against the polished mahogany table. The smug, arrogant grin melted off his face, leaving behind a look of absolute sheer horror. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide with rising panic. All of the legal jargon he had thrown at me, all of the condescending threats he had made, suddenly crashed down upon him. Chloe completely froze. The crystal nail file she was holding slipped from her manicured hand and dropped onto the floor. She stared at me, her jaw literally hanging open, unable to comprehend how the sister she had spent her entire life mocking was suddenly the billionaire owner of her husband's prestigious law firm. My father collapsed heavily into his chair. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning completely white. He looked at me with a desperate, pleading expression, silently begging me to tell him that Richard was mistaken. He wanted me to be the failure he had always told everyone I was. He needed me to be beneath him so he could maintain his fragile sense of superiority. I did not offer him any comfort. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out a small, sleek, matte black rectangle. It was the exact same piece of paper he had carelessly tossed onto the tablecloth at the upscale steakhouse just a few nights ago. I placed it on the polished wood surface and gave it a firm push with my index finger. The card slid smoothly across the long expanse of the mahogany table. It slowed to a perfect stop right in front of my father's trembling hands. The embossed gold letters caught the bright light from the overhead chandelier. "Like I said, Dad," I whispered, my voice cold, steady, and completely ruthless. "Chief Technology Officer." My father stared down at the small black rectangle resting on the polished mahogany table. He blinked rapidly as if his eyes were deceiving him. The gold foil logo embossed on the thick cardstock caught the overhead light. It was the exact same logo he had seen printed on the massive acquisition documents Richard Vance had just rushed in with. It was the insignia of Apex Tech. His jaw physically dropped. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and old. He reached out with a trembling hand but stopped before his fingers could brush the edge of the card. He looked up at me, and the realization of what he had done finally washed over him. I was the architect of his entire professional reality. The heavy silence in the boardroom was suddenly shattered by the sharp scraping sound of a wooden chair being pushed back violently. Chloe jumped up, her face contorted with a mixture of sheer panic and furious denial. "This is a trick," she screamed, pointing an accusing finger at Richard Vance and then at me. "This is some kind of sick, elaborate prank. You are all lying. There is absolutely no way that she owns anything. She is a college dropout. She fixes broken hard drives in a rented basement. A black woman with no degrees does not just wake up and own a billion-dollar tech empire. You are letting her play you, Richard. She fabricated these documents to make herself look important because she has always been insanely jealous of my perfect life." She was hyperventilating, her designer handbag falling from her shoulder and crashing onto the hardwood floor. She looked desperately toward Chad, expecting him to stand up and use his brilliant legal mind to shut me down. But Chad remained frozen in his seat. He was staring blindly at the dropped silver pen on the table, his breathing shallow and erratic. He knew it was not a trick. He knew the level of security protecting those corporate networks. The only way I could have accessed the offshore accounts and the encrypted billing software was if I had top-tier administrative clearance. Chloe then turned her frantic gaze to our father, but Marcus was just as paralyzed. His eyes darted between my face and the business card. The patriarchal authority he had wielded over me for my entire life had completely evaporated. I did not raise my voice. I did not bother trying to argue with my hysterical sister. Her frantic denial was the pathetic, desperate flailing of someone whose entire identity was built on a false sense of superiority. Instead, I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my sleek silver tablet. I tapped the screen and entered my master administrative passcode. The boardroom immediately responded to my command. The automatic blinds on the floor-to-ceiling glass windows smoothly lowered, sealing us off from the outside office. The main lights dimmed to a soft, ambient glow. With a soft mechanical hum, the massive dual projector screens descended from the ceiling at the far end of the room. The integrated technology of the building was fully under my control, and I was going to display the absolute truth. I swiped my finger across the glass tablet, and the screens flared to life. On the left screen, the official acquisition documents from Global Holdings appeared in crisp, high definition. It displayed the finalized signatures, the exact transfer of executive power, and the official seal designating Apex Tech as the new parent entity of Martinez Law Firm. On the right screen, I projected the corporate organizational chart. Right at the top, sitting directly above Richard Vance, above the board of directors, and above every single senior partner in the building, was my name. Maya, Chief Technology Officer and majority shareholder. The glowing white text illuminated the dark room, casting long shadows across the faces of my family members. They were staring at an indisputable legal reality that shattered their deeply ingrained delusions. Martinez Law Firm had stood in this prestigious city for over 60 years. My father had worshipped its corporate legacy, treating the mahogany walls like a sacred religion. Now I legally owned every brick of his temple. I stood up slowly, picking up my silver tablet, and walked around the massive mahogany table. I paced slowly behind Chad, who flinched as if I were about to physically strike him. I stopped directly behind my father's leather chair, resting my hand casually on the backrest. Richard Vance remained standing near the door, his head bowed in deference. He understood the new hierarchy perfectly. He knew that one wrong word from him would result in his immediate termination. The room felt incredibly small, and the air grew thick with the suffocating weight of my undeniable authority. I looked at the three of them, the people who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless, telling me I was a failure, telling me I did not belong. Chloe had finally stopped screaming. She stared up at the massive glowing screens, her chest heaving as she read the legal documents proving her absolute nightmare was completely real. The wealth she had flaunted, the status she had weaponized against me, it was all dependent on the very company I had built from the ground up. I had created the wealth that funded her luxury cars and her diamond necklaces. I had signed the corporate checks that paid for Chad's unearned promotions. I had built the powerful corporate umbrella that shielded my father from the severe consequences of his own rampant incompetence. And now I was folding that umbrella shut. I walked back to the head of the table and stood behind the managing partner's chair. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. "I didn't just fire you as a client," I said smoothly. "I bought the building, which means you are currently sitting in my chair in my firm." The absolute silence in the boardroom was deafening. No one dared to breathe. My words hung in the cold air, pressing down on them with the crushing weight of reality. Chad was the first to try and break the spell. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously as he desperately tried to cling to the illusion of his legal authority. "Even if you bought the parent company," "Maya," he stammered, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form the words. "Even if you own the building, that does not excuse the fact that your subsidiary breached a formal contract. We still have grounds for a lawsuit. You still owe this firm damages for the revenue we lost." He was grasping at straws, completely blind to the fact that I was not there to defend myself against his fabricated lawsuit. I was there to perform a public execution. I did not even bother answering him. I simply looked down at my silver tablet and swiped my finger sharply across the smooth glass screen. The dual projectors overhead whirred softly, and the image on the massive screens instantly changed. The corporate acquisition documents vanished. In their place, a complex web of financial data illuminated the dark boardroom. The left screen displayed an intricate blockchain ledger filled with hundreds of highlighted transactions. The right screen showed high-resolution copies of internal firm accounting spreadsheets, directly cross-referenced with secure server login timestamps. It was a digital map of absolute corruption. "Let us talk about that lost revenue, Chad," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the massive mahogany table. "Let us talk about why Vanguard Solutions abruptly terminated their contract with Martinez Law Firm. Companies do not just walk away from long-term partnerships for no reason. They walk away when their internal cybersecurity algorithms detect massive ongoing financial discrepancies." I pressed another button on my tablet, zooming in on a specific section of the spreadsheet. The numbers expanded, filling the entire screen in glaring red font. For the past 2 years, Chad, you have been systematically logging out of the Vanguard Secure Client portal at 5 o'clock in the evening. Yet somehow you have been billing the client for legal research and document review, extending well past midnight every single night, including weekends and federal holidays. Chad gripped the edges of the table so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. I stepped away from the head of the table and walked slowly down the length of the room, stopping directly across from where he was sitting. I raised my hand and pointed my index finger straight at his chest. "You have been overbilling my company for work you never performed," I stated coldly, enunciating every single word so the recording system would capture it perfectly. "You fabricated over 4,000 hours of fake legal services. But you did not just pad your timesheets to get a bigger yearly bonus. You took it a massive step further." I swiped the tablet again. The screen shifted to display a series of international wire transfers. The destination accounts were flagged with bright yellow warning markers. I pointed to a specific column of numbers tracing the digital path of the stolen money. "You created a phantom vendor account buried deep within the firm accounting software," I continued. "You siphoned the excess cash generated by your inflated hours, and you wired exactly $2.5 million out of the firm escrow accounts directly into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. I have the exact Internet Protocol addresses used to initiate those transfers. They perfectly match the computer sitting on your desk right down the hall. That is not a simple billing error, Chad. That is textbook federal wire fraud. It is embezzlement. It is grand larceny, and it carries a mandatory federal prison sentence." The last shred of Chad's arrogant facade completely disintegrated. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. Sweat began to bead heavily on his forehead, reflecting the bright light of the projector screens. He reached up with a trembling hand and aggressively loosened his expensive silk tie, suddenly unable to breathe in the suffocating atmosphere of the boardroom. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the reality of a federal prison sentence crashed down upon his shoulders. The man who had just threatened to audit my company and ruin my life was now openly trembling in his custom suit. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. Finally, his panicked eyes locked onto my father. "Marcus, you have to do something," Chad pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You are the senior partner. You have to tell them this is a mistake. Tell Richard I was just following standard firm billing protocols. Tell them you authorized those accounts. You have to protect me, Marcus. Please do not let her do this to me." But my father did not move. He was completely frozen in his plush leather chair. He stared blankly at the glowing screens, his mind desperately trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the crimes being displayed. He had spent years bragging about Chad's brilliant legal mind, completely oblivious to the fact that his golden son-in-law was a common thief using his firm as a personal piggy bank. Richard Vance let out a low, horrified gasp from the back of the room. As the managing partner, he knew exactly what this meant for the legacy of his firm. If the federal authorities discovered that a senior associate had been actively embezzling millions of dollars from their largest corporate client, the resulting scandal would destroy their reputation overnight. They would lose every major client on their roster. The firm would face massive federal fines and potential dissolution. Richard looked at Chad with a mixture of absolute hatred and pure terror. "You stupid, arrogant boy," Richard hissed, taking a threatening step toward the table. "You have destroyed this entire firm. You have ruined all of us. I will personally see to it that you never practice law again. I will hand you over to the federal authorities myself." Chad shrank back into his chair, tears welling up in his terrified eyes. He turned his desperate gaze back to my father, begging for him to intervene, begging for him to use his patriarchal authority to stop the nightmare. "Please, Marcus." Chad whimpered, his voice echoing pathetically against the glass walls. You have to fix this. You are my family. I watched my father slowly turn his head to look at the weeping, pathetic man he had chosen over me for his entire life. My father opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer some weak defense, or to beg me for mercy on behalf of his beloved son-in-law. But before he could utter a single word, I tapped my silver tablet one final time. The screens shifted again. This time, the display showed high-resolution zoomed-in photographs of the internal firm authorization forms required for every single international wire transfer Chad had executed. The forms were blown up to massive proportions, filling the entire wall. I would not ask him for help, Chad, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Because he cannot save you. He cannot even save himself. I pointed up at the massive glowing screens. At the bottom of every single fraudulent transfer document, right next to Chad's signature, was a second signature. It was the sweeping, familiar loops of my father's handwriting, boldly authorizing the theft of millions of dollars. My father stared at the screens, his eyes widening in absolute horror as the final trap snapped entirely shut. He stopped breathing entirely. Because, as you can clearly see, I announced to the silent room, my father's signature is on every single fraudulent transfer. Because, as you can clearly see, I announced to the silent room, my father's signature is on every single fraudulent transfer. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. My father slumped back in his plush leather chair, looking like a completely deflated balloon. The paralyzing shock, however, did not last long for my sister. Chloe possessed a vicious survival instinct built entirely on selfishness and manipulation. The moment she realized the immense legal magnitude of the crimes projected on the wall, she instantly shifted into self-preservation mode. She did not rush to comfort our father. She did not stand by the husband she had defended so aggressively just moments before. Instead, Chloe turned completely feral. She spun around and glared at Chad with pure, unfiltered hatred. "How could you do this?" she shrieked, her voice echoing sharply against the thick glass walls. "You absolute idiot! You told me you were earning those bonuses legally. You told me you were billing legitimate hours for Vanguard Solutions. I am a respected attorney, Chad. I serve on charity boards. I have a flawless reputation in this city, and you have completely ruined me." She began pacing frantically back and forth, running her manicured hands through her perfect blonde hair. "I knew absolutely nothing about this," she announced to the room, directing her desperate plea toward Richard Vance and then to me. "I swear on my life I had no idea he was embezzling money. I thought he was just a highly successful senior associate earning massive firm bonuses. He lied to me. He manipulated my trust. You cannot hold me responsible for the criminal actions of my husband. I am entirely innocent in all of this." Chad stared at his wife, his mouth hanging open in utter disbelief. The woman who had sworn to love him and stand by him was throwing him under a speeding bus without a single second thought. He reached out a trembling hand toward her, trying to speak, but she slapped it away viciously. "Do not touch me," she hissed, backing away from him, as if he were carrying a deadly, highly contagious disease. "I am filing for divorce this afternoon. I will not let you drag my good name down into federal prison with you." It was a spectacular performance. If I did not have the exact digital receipts, I might have almost believed her desperate victim narrative. She played the role of the betrayed wife with flawless conviction. But I was not sitting in the audience of her little theatrical production. I was the one running the entire projector. I let her scream and play the victim for a few more moments, allowing her to firmly establish her ridiculous defense. Then I slowly raised my silver tablet. "That is a truly compelling story, Chloe," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical rambling. "It is a massive shame that your own digital footprint completely contradicts your performance." I swiped my finger across the smooth glass screen. The massive dual projectors whirred again, and the glowing display of offshore bank transfers vanished. In their place, a massive high-resolution screenshot of a private text message thread illuminated the dark boardroom. The messages were dated exactly 3 months ago. Chloe froze dead in her tracks. All the blood drained from her face as she stared up at her own words projected 10 feet tall across the wall. "Let us read this together, shall we?" I offered, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and incredibly cold. "This is a text exchange between you and Chad regarding the purchase of your brand new luxury yacht. Chad writes that he is worried about a sudden financial audit and suggests delaying the boat purchase. And here is your direct response, Chloe." I pointed to the massive green text bubble on the right side of the screen. "You wrote, 'Do not be a coward, Chad. The Vanguard money is completely untraceable. Marcus already signed off on the Cayman transfer. Just move the bonus money to the Shell account and buy the boat before summer starts. Nobody is going to audit us." The boardroom was dead silent once again. Richard Vance let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head in absolute disgust. My father closed his eyes, unable to look at the massive glowing proof of his daughter's deep involvement in a massive criminal conspiracy. "You did not just know about the embezzled money, Chloe," I stated, stepping away from the head of the table and walking slowly toward her. "You actively encouraged it. You advised him on exactly how to hide the stolen funds. You used the stolen Vanguard money to fund your lavish lifestyle, and you openly acknowledged that our father was helping you cover it up. That makes you a direct accomplice to federal wire fraud and international money laundering. You are not a victim, Chloe. You are a co-conspirator. And as a practicing attorney, your active participation in this fraud guarantees you will be permanently disbarred alongside your husband." The absolute reality of her situation finally shattered the last remaining pieces of her golden child facade. The arrogant, entitled woman who had thrown a cup of iced coffee at me just 24 hours prior completely ceased to exist. She looked up at the massive text messages and realized her perfect life was entirely over. She would lose her luxury house. She would lose her expensive cars. She would lose her prestigious law license. And she was going to federal prison. Her legs gave out completely. Chloe collapsed right there in the middle of the expensive Persian rug. She dropped heavily to her knees, her designer skirt pooling around her on the floor. She looked up at me, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear in her eyes. The tears began to spill over her cheeks, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. "Maya, please," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate wail. "Please do not do this. I am so sorry. I was greedy, and I was stupid. But you cannot turn these documents over to the authorities. They will take everything from me. They will lock me away in a cell. You have to delete the files, Maya. You have to protect me." She reached out and grabbed the hem of my tailored suit jacket, sobbing hysterically. I looked down at the woman who had spent 33 years making me feel completely worthless. I looked at the sister who had happily participated in a frivolous lawsuit designed to steal my livelihood and bankrupt my small business just hours ago. She was begging for mercy from the very person she had aggressively tried to destroy. "We are family, Maya," she cried, looking up at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "We share the exact same blood. You cannot do this to your own sister. You cannot send us to prison." "Please, Maya, I am begging you." I stood perfectly still, letting her pathetic tears soak into the expensive fabric of my suit. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The little girl who used to desperately want her sister's approval had died a long time ago. I reached down and firmly peeled her manicured fingers off my jacket. I stepped back, creating a clear physical boundary between my absolute success and her absolute ruin. I looked down into her terrified, sobbing face. "Family does not send family fake lawsuits to steal their livelihood," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. "Family does not send family fake lawsuits to steal their livelihood," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. I turned my back on my weeping sister, leaving her kneeling on the expensive Persian rug in her ruined designer clothes. Her pathetic sobs echoed through the large boardroom, but I tuned them out entirely. I walked back toward the head of the mahogany table where my father and Chad remained paralyzed by their impending doom. Richard Vance had watched the entire exchange with a grim, stoic expression. He was a man who understood the brutal nature of corporate power, and he recognized that the old regime of Martinez law firm was officially dead. It was time for him to execute my final orders and secure his own position in my new executive structure. Richard stepped forward, picking up his expensive leather briefcase from a side chair. He placed it squarely on the table and snapped the brass locks open with a sharp, echoing click. He reached inside and pulled out two thick manila folders, dropping them onto the polished wood with a heavy, resounding thud. He looked at the two men with absolute disgust. He slid the first folder directly in front of Chad and pushed the second one roughly over to my father. "Those are your formal termination papers," Richard announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "As of this exact moment, neither of you are employed by Martinez Law Firm or any subsidiary of Global Holdings. Your building access codes have already been deactivated. Your corporate credit cards are canceled. Security is currently clearing out your respective offices and boxing up your personal belongings. You will not be allowed to return to your desks under any circumstances." Chad stared blindly at the folder, unable to process the speed at which his entire life had been completely dismantled. He looked like a man standing on the tracks, watching a freight train barrel toward him, unable to move a single muscle. But Richard was not finished. Furthermore, Richard continued tapping his index finger aggressively against the thick files. "I have personally contacted the State Bar Association early this morning. We have submitted the blockchain data, the offshore routing numbers, and the forged signature authorizations directly to the Ethics Committee. Given the overwhelming digital evidence and the sheer magnitude of the financial theft, your legal licenses will be suspended by the end of the business day. You will both be permanently disbarred." The word disbarred hung in the air like a death sentence. For a corporate attorney, losing a law license was the ultimate permanent disgrace. It meant total professional annihilation. My father stared at the manila folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. 35 years of climbing the ruthless corporate ladder. 35 years of shaking hands at exclusive country clubs and building a pristine public image were completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. He was going to lose his corner office, his massive pension, and his entire identity. He would be known in the legal community as a disgraced fraud, and his name would be entirely erased from the firm letterhead by tomorrow morning. Marcus realized that his managing partner was completely loyal to me now. He realized that Chad was utterly useless and Chloe was a hysterical, useless mess on the floor. He had no legal maneuvers left to play. He had no corporate leverage to exploit. So he desperately resorted to the only manipulative tactic he had left in his arsenal. He tried to play the emotional father card. He stood up slowly, his knees trembling slightly, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. He forced a sickeningly sweet smile onto his pale, sweating face, attempting to manufacture a look of deep paternal pride. "Maya, my little girl," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his own desperation. "You have to look at the bigger picture here. You have to understand why I did the things I did." I crossed my arms and stared at him, waiting to hear how he would possibly justify stealing millions of dollars and trying to completely bankrupt me. "I pushed you hard, Maya," he pleaded, stepping away from his chair and moving slowly toward me. "I was tough on you your entire life because I saw your massive potential. I knew you had a brilliant mind, but you were always so incredibly stubborn. I had to be strict with you. I had to challenge you to make you hungry for real success. And look at you now. Look at what you have accomplished. You are a billionaire. You own this entire building. You defeated me at my own ruthless game. This was all tough love, Maya. I made you the powerful woman you are today. You cannot destroy your own father for teaching you how to survive in a cutthroat world." It was the most twisted, narcissistic monologue I had ever heard. He was literally trying to take credit for the massive tech empire I built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. He wanted to reframe decades of emotional neglect, relentless belittling, and blatant favoritism as some kind of master parenting strategy. He thought he could manipulate my emotions by pretending his cruelty was actually a profound act of love. He thought I was still the little girl desperate for his validation. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that silenced his pathetic speech instantly. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing merely inches away from his face. I looked directly into his panicked, searching eyes, refusing to let him look away. "Do not you ever try to take credit for my brilliance?" I whispered, my voice colder than ice. "You did not build me, Dad. I built myself in spite of you. I succeeded because I wanted to get as far away from your toxic shadow as humanly possible." I pointed to the massive glowing screens projecting the irrefutable evidence of his massive criminal conspiracy. "You did not steal millions of dollars to teach me a lesson." I continued, my voice rising in volume and intensity. "You did not file a fake lawsuit against my company to make me stronger. You did it because you are a greedy, pathetic man who worshipped a son-in-law simply because he was white and held a fancy law degree. You enabled abuse. You humiliated me in public. You stood by and watched your family tear me down because it made you feel incredibly powerful." My father flinched, stepping backward as if I had physically struck him across the face. "It was not tough love, Dad," I stated firmly, delivering the final crushing blow to his fragile ego. "It was abuse. It was pure, unadulterated abuse. And you just picked the exact wrong target." My father opened his mouth to argue, to beg, or to make another pathetic excuse, but the words died completely in his throat. He looked at me and finally realized that the obedient, desperate daughter he could easily manipulate was gone forever. I was untouchable. Suddenly, the tense, heavy silence in the boardroom was pierced by a sharp wailing sound, bleeding through the thick, soundproof glass windows. It was faint at first, but it grew rapidly louder and more intense. The distinct, high-pitched shriek of multiple sirens echoed off the surrounding concrete skyscrapers. We all turned our heads toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Down on the street level several blocks away, but moving incredibly fast, the flashing red and blue lights of federal law enforcement vehicles were tearing through the morning traffic. The convoy of black SUVs was heading directly for the Martinez law firm building. The FBI had arrived for Chad. The heavy glass door of the boardroom swung open. It was not Richard Vance this time. 3 federal agents, wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their backs, stepped into the room. Their presence instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the space. They moved with absolute, terrifying precision. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, walked directly toward Chad. He did not ask for permission, and he did not care about the expensive mahogany table or the prestigious reputation of the law firm. He unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Chad Theodore Miller," the agent said, his voice booming with absolute governmental authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and international money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The reality of the situation finally broke Chad's fragile psychological dam. The arrogant corporate attorney who had strutted into this room demanding my financial ruin completely collapsed. He let out a high-pitched guttural sob that sounded like a wounded animal. "No, no, please, there has been a huge mistake," he wailed, tears streaming down his flushed face. "I am a senior associate. You cannot do this to me. Marcus, tell them. Chloe, do something." He looked desperately at his wife, but Chloe scrambled backward across the Persian rug, pressing her back against the glass wall to get as far away from him as possible. She was not going to let his sinking ship pull her under. He looked at my father, but Marcus was already standing up slowly, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. A security guard had just entered the room and handed my father a flattened cardboard box, silently instructing him to begin packing the remnants of his shattered 35-year career. The federal agent grabbed Chad's arm, forcefully hauling him to his feet. Chad resisted, his legs turning to absolute jelly. He cried like a frightened child, snot and tears running down his chin, ruining his expensive silk tie. "Please, I have money, I can pay it back," he begged hysterically, as the agent roughly pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed loudly through the silent boardroom. It was the sound of absolute finality. The gold and white son-in-law, the man my family had worshipped as the pinnacle of success, was being dragged out of the room in disgrace, his expensive leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the hardwood floor. Just as the agents were pulling Chad through the doorway, a sudden commotion erupted in the executive hallway. I heard the sharp clicking of heels and a familiar shrill voice screaming at the receptionist. Moments later, my mother burst into the boardroom. She was completely out of breath, her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. Chloe had obviously texted her in a blind panic the moment the text messages were projected on the wall. My mother stopped dead in her tracks, taking in the absolute catastrophe unfolding in front of her. She watched in sheer horror as federal agents Perp walked her beloved son-in-law out to the elevators. She saw Chloe sitting on the floor, weeping hysterically with her mascara running down her face. Then her eyes landed on my father. Marcus, the proud patriarch, was standing near the mahogany table, silently folding the bottom flaps of a cheap cardboard box, preparing to empty his desk under the watchful eye of a firm security guard. My mother could not process the fact that her husband and her golden child were responsible for their own destruction. Her brain was so heavily conditioned to protect the patriarchal image of the family that she immediately sought out the only person she had ever been allowed to blame. She turned her head, and her furious eyes locked onto me. I was standing near the head of the table, completely untouched by the chaos, radiating absolute calm in my custom-tailored suit. The sight of my unapologetic power pushed her entirely over the edge. "What have you done?" she screamed, her voice tearing through her throat. "You wicked, ungrateful girl! You destroyed this family! You tore us apart because you could not stand to see your sister happy! You are a monster, Maya!" She lunged at me. She crossed the room in 3 rapid strides, raising her right hand high into the air. She fully intended to slap me across the face, just like she had done countless times when I was a teenager, to put me in my place, to silence my voice, and to physically force me back into my role as the family punching bag. But I was not a teenager anymore. I was a titan. As her hand swung down toward my face with all the bitter resentment she carried, I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply raised my arm and caught her wrist in mid-air. The impact stopped her entirely in her tracks. My grip was like iron, locking her arm firmly in place. My mother gasped, her eyes widening in absolute shock. For the first time in her life, she met a physical and emotional boundary she could not break through. She tried to pull her arm away, but I held onto her wrist, refusing to let her escape the confrontation. I stepped closer, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "I did not destroy this family, Mom," I said. My voice low, dangerously calm, and completely unwavering. "This family was destroyed the moment you decided to protect an abusive husband and a corrupt son-in-law instead of loving your own daughter." She trembled under my grip, trying to look away, but I tightened my hold slightly, forcing her to face the devastating reality she had ignored for 33 years. "You cannot blame me for the mess they made," I told her, my words slicing through the silent room. "You stood by and watched them mock me. You told me to dress properly today so I would not embarrass my father. You wanted me to sit down, shut up, and let them steal everything I built just so you could keep your expensive house and your country club membership. You enabled their greed. You fed their arrogance. And you sacrificed me on the altar of your own pathetic social status." Tears welled up in my mother's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, terrifying realization. The delusion she had built her entire life upon was actively crumbling around her. She looked at Marcus, who could not even make eye contact with her. She looked at Chloe, who was still sobbing on the floor, clutching her designer purse like a life raft. "You have spent decades defending toxic men because you were too weak to stand up for yourself," I whispered, leaning in closer so only she could hear the absolute truth. "You taught your daughters that their only value was in serving the egos of the men around them. You let my father belittle my intelligence because it made him feel strong. But I am not you. I do not carry your generational trauma. I do not accept your weakness. I am breaking the curse right here and right now. I am the one who built the empire, and I am the one burning your fake castle to the ground. Look closely, Mom. Look at the ruins of the men you worshipped, and understand that I did this to protect myself from you. My mother stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. The iron grip I had on her wrist remained steady, refusing to let her pull away from the consequences of her own actions. She had never been forced to look at the ugly truth behind her pristine suburban life. For decades, she had lived in a comfortable bubble, funded by my father's arrogance and eventually his criminal activities. She had actively chosen to ignore his cruelty toward me because confronting it would mean risking her lavish lifestyle. Listen to me very carefully, Mom. I continued, lowering my voice so that the absolute finality of my words would cut through the chaotic noise of the boardroom. The FBI is not just taking Chad away in handcuffs. The federal authorities are freezing every single asset connected to Martinez's law firm and the personal accounts of anyone involved in this massive embezzlement scheme. That includes the joint bank accounts you share with Dad. Her eyes widened in fresh horror. She shook her head desperately, trying to deny the inevitable. But Maya, the house? She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The mortgage, the country club fees, the car payments, the maintenance on the property. We have bills to pay. Gone, I said coldly, releasing her wrist at last. My mother stumbled back a step, rubbing her arm as if my touch had physically burned her. All of it was funded by stolen money. The federal government will seize your sprawling colonial house by the end of the month. They will impound your luxury vehicles. The credit cards you used to buy Chloe's diamond necklaces and your designer clothes will be declined by this afternoon. You have absolutely nothing left in your name. She began to sob again, burying her face in her hands. What am I supposed to do? She wailed, looking around the room for someone to save her. I am a senior citizen, Maya. I cannot live on the street. I have never worked a day in my adult life. You are going to do something you should have done 30 years ago, I replied without a single ounce of sympathy. You are going to get a job. You are going to learn how to support yourself, instead of relying on toxic men who steal from other people. Welcome to the real world, Mom. It is a lot harder when you actually have to earn your keep, instead of just spending the money other people bleed for. I turned my attention to the rest of the room. Chloe was still weeping on the Persian rug, rocking back and forth as her entire identity dissolved into nothingness. My father was standing by the mahogany table, staring blankly into his empty cardboard box. I needed to make my final position incredibly clear so there would be absolutely no misunderstandings moving forward. This is the last time any of you will ever see me or speak to me, I announced, my voice projecting with clear, authoritative command. By the time I reach the ground floor of this building, my phone number will be permanently changed. Your emails are already blocked by my corporate firewall. I have instructed my personal security team and the building management at my penthouse to deny you entry. Chloe looked up, her face streaked with black mascara, her blonde hair tangled and messy. Maya, you cannot just abandon us, she cried out weakly, her voice raspy from screaming. I am not abandoning you, Chloe, I corrected her sharply, looking down at her pathetic form. I am excising a tumor. If any of you try to approach my home, my office, or my person, I will immediately file for restraining orders. I have the best legal team in the state of New York on my personal payroll, and they will not hesitate to drag you into federal court for harassment. Do not test me on this. I will lock you away myself if you try to cross my boundaries. My mother reached out a trembling hand toward me, but she stopped before she could even touch the fabric of my suit. The invisible wall between us was now fully constructed and reinforced with steel. She finally understood that the daughter she had emotionally abused for decades was entirely gone. There was no more guilt left to exploit. I picked up my designer handbag from the head of the boardroom table. I smoothed the lapels of my custom gray power suit, feeling the incredible lightness expanding in my chest. I turned toward the heavy glass door, preparing to leave the absolute wreckage of my former family behind. My father was standing directly in my path. Marcus, the once terrifying patriarch of the family, the senior partner who commanded respect and fear from everyone around him, was now just a broken old man. He was clutching a cheap brown cardboard box against his chest. Inside the box were a few pathetic framed photographs and some expensive silver pens that no longer held any power. He was completely stripped of his dignity, his prestigious title, and his stolen wealth. He looked small, defeated, and incredibly pathetic. He looked at me as I approached his position. His eyes were red and filled with a desperate, unspeakable sorrow. He opened his mouth perhaps to offer a final apology or to beg for a sliver of mercy. He wanted me to acknowledge him, to give him some tiny piece of closure or validation. He needed me to see him as a father one last time. I did not slow my pace. I did not break my stride. I looked straight through him as if he were completely invisible. I walked past him without a single second glance, leaving him standing there holding his box of meaningless trinkets. He was no longer my father. He was just a fired employee vacating my commercial building. I pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the quiet executive hallway. The junior associates and paralegals were standing around in shocked clusters, having witnessed Chad's dramatic arrest just moments before. They quickly parted ways from me, lowering their eyes in absolute respect and fear as the new owner of the company walked past them. I ignored them all, keeping my head held high, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I reached the end of the corridor and pressed the glowing button for the private executive elevator. The silver doors slid open instantly with a soft mechanical chime. I stepped inside the pristine glass cab and turned around to face the hallway. Through the long corridor, I could see the open door of the boardroom. I could see my mother sobbing against the glass wall. I could see Chloe curled up on the floor, completely ruined. And I could see my father standing exactly where I had left him, staring into his cardboard box, his legacy entirely erased. The elevator doors began to slide shut. I looked at the ruined faces of my abusers, the people who had tried to break my spirit and steal my success. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad or vindictive. As the heavy doors closed, completely sealing me off from their toxic world forever, I took a deep breath. For the first time in my entire 33 years of life, I felt nothing but absolute perfect peace. 1 month later, the explosive news of the Martinez law firm scandal officially hit the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The massive headline detailed the millions of dollars stolen and the incredible corporate restructuring initiated by Apex Tech. The pristine public image my father had worshipped for 35 years was publicly and permanently shattered. The federal judge overseeing the embezzlement case formally denied Chad bail, citing his hidden offshore bank accounts and declaring him an extreme flight risk. The golden white son-in-law was currently sitting in a cold federal holding cell, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, awaiting a trial that would inevitably end with a decade in federal prison. The State Bar Association did not hesitate to act upon the mountain of encrypted digital evidence my team provided. Marcus was officially and publicly disbarred, stripped of his legal license, and forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy to protect himself from the tidal wave of incoming civil lawsuits filed by furious former clients. The sprawling colonial house in the affluent suburbs, the very house where I had been endlessly humiliated, was seized by federal authorities just as I predicted. My parents were forced to pack whatever meager belongings the government allowed them to keep and move into a cheap rented condominium on the industrial outskirts of the city. My mother finally had to face the terrifying reality of applying for hourly retail jobs at the age of 60 just to keep the lights on and pay for their basic groceries. The devastating reality was even harsher for my sister. Chloe had built her entire identity around her proximity to wealth and status. With her husband locked in a federal detention center and her own law license permanently suspended, pending a criminal conspiracy investigation, she had absolutely nothing left. She was evicted from her luxury estate and forced into a cramped studio apartment that smelled like cheap paint and old carpet. The woman who had thrown a $15,000 bribe across a coffee shop table just weeks ago was now desperately trying to survive on pennies. I received detailed reports from mutual acquaintances that Chloe was spending her days taking the public bus to local pawn shops. She was forced to sell her beloved designer handbags, her diamond necklaces, and the expensive luxury watches she used to flaunt at family gatherings just to pay the retainer fee for a bottom-tier defense attorney. Her wealthy friends from the charity boards and the exclusive country clubs immediately cut all ties with her, treating her like an absolute pariah. She had alienated everyone who actually cared about her in pursuit of a false elite image, and now she was entirely alone in a tiny apartment surrounded by the terrifying consequences of her own boundless greed and entitlement. While their toxic world burned entirely to the ground, my life expanded into something incredibly beautiful and deeply fulfilling. The financial markets responded phenomenally to Apex Tech acquiring and optimizing the massive legal network of global holdings. Our company stock skyrocketed, doubling in value within a single week and cementing our status as an unstoppable tech giant. I was featured on the cover of major national business magazines, celebrated as a visionary leader and a fierce protector of corporate integrity. I used a fraction of my new personal wealth to purchase a breathtaking private estate overlooking the ocean. It was a massive modern architectural masterpiece with floor-to-ceiling glass walls and a sprawling manicured garden that stretched out toward the crashing waves. It was a sanctuary of absolute peace, far away from the dark, heavy memories of my childhood home. To celebrate the monumental success of the corporate acquisition, I decided to host a lavish dinner party at my new estate. But this was not going to be anything like the suffocating, toxic Sunday dinners my family used to force me to attend. I did not invite people out of a misplaced sense of biological obligation or guilt. I invited my chosen family. The massive dining table was filled with the people who had actually supported me, respected my firm boundaries, and celebrated my brilliance. David and Julian were there laughing loudly and sharing fond stories about our difficult early startup days. My incredible mentors, the brilliant Black women who had guided me through the ruthless corporate world, raised their crystal glasses in my honor. The private chef I hired served an incredible multi-course meal, featuring exquisite dishes that far surpassed anything my mother had ever cooked. The air was filled with genuine warmth, loud, joyful laughter, and absolute mutual respect. There were no backhanded compliments. There were no cruel jokes disguised as teasing. No one was trying to diminish my accomplishments to make themselves feel bigger. I sat at the head of the table, looking at the beautiful, brilliant people surrounding me, and I realized I had finally found my true family. The next morning, the massive estate was incredibly quiet and peaceful. The professional catering crew had cleaned everything perfectly, leaving the house immaculate before they departed. I walked into my sprawling modern kitchen wearing a comfortable silk robe, listening to the gentle sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore outside my window. I poured myself a cup of dark, rich coffee from the espresso machine and walked over to the massive marble island where my executive assistant had neatly stacked my personal morning mail. I sifted slowly through the pristine corporate envelopes, the glossy charity gala invitations, and the letters of congratulations from various industry leaders. My hand suddenly stopped when I reached the very bottom of the stack. Resting against the cold, smooth marble was a plain, cheap white envelope. I stared at the familiar sweeping loops of the handwriting, instantly recognizing the distinct penmanship that had arrogantly authorized millions of dollars in stolen funds. It was a handwritten letter from my father sent from the return address of his cheap rented condominium. I slowly set my warm coffee mug down. I stood completely alone in my beautiful sunlit kitchen, staring in absolute silence at the unopened letter from the ruined man whose empire I had completely destroyed. I stood in the sunlight filtering through my kitchen windows, looking down at the cheap white envelope resting on the marble counter. My father's name was scribbled in the top left corner. I knew exactly what was inside that envelope. It would be a carefully constructed masterpiece of manipulation. There would be paragraphs of manufactured guilt, mixed with subtle attempts to shift the blame onto Chad. He would probably talk about how much he sacrificed for me when I was a child, hoping to trigger some deep-seated sense of biological debt. He would ask for forgiveness. But what he really wanted was access. He wanted a financial lifeline. He wanted me to rescue him from the catastrophic consequences of his own arrogance. For 33 years, I would have torn that envelope open with trembling hands, desperate to find even a single sentence of genuine love or validation. I would have read it over and over again, trying to decode the toxic breadcrumbs he left behind. But today I felt absolutely nothing. The little girl who needed her father's approval was completely gone, and the woman who stood in her place had absolutely no use for his empty words. I picked up the envelope. It felt incredibly light in my hands. I did not break the seal. I did not even hold it up to the light to try and glimpse the words inside. I walked across the kitchen to the small home office area tucked into the corner of the room. I reached out and pressed the power button on my heavy-duty paper shredder. The machine hummed to life with a low, steady vibration. Without a single moment of hesitation, I dropped the unopened envelope into the feeding slot. The sharp steel blades caught the paper, instantly pulling it down with a loud, aggressive grinding noise. In less than 3 seconds, the apologies, the excuses, and the desperate manipulations of my father were reduced to a pile of meaningless white confetti. I turned off the machine, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my entire body. It was finally over, the final tie was completely severed. I walked back to the kitchen island and picked up my warm coffee mug. Taking a slow, comforting sip, I looked directly out at the beautiful, crashing waves of the ocean, and I realized something incredibly important about the journey I had just completed. I want to speak directly to anyone watching this right now who understands the heavy, crushing weight of family expectations. But more specifically, I want to speak to the women who look like me. As an African American woman, we are often raised with a silent, deeply ingrained expectation that we are supposed to be the strong ones. We are conditioned from a very early age to carry the heavy burdens of everyone around us. We are expected to swallow our pride, ignore our own boundaries, and constantly sacrifice our own mental health to protect the fragile egos of the men in our families. Society, and sometimes our own toxic relatives, expect us to act as the unconditional mules of the world if we achieve success, if we build wealth, or create something beautiful out of our own hard work. It is immediately treated as a communal resource. We are supposed to quietly fund the family lifestyle, endure the disrespect, and step in to fix the disastrous mistakes of the golden children who are given every single advantage. We are told that family is everything, and that blood requires absolute loyalty even when that same blood is actively poisoning us. We are taught to endure abuse and call it tough love. We are expected to forgive the unforgivable simply because the people hurting us share our last name. But that is a complete lie. That is a generational curse, designed to keep us exhausted, depleted, and entirely under their control. I refuse to be their mule. I refuse to let my hard-earned success become the financial safety net for their criminal behavior and their blatant disrespect. Breaking those generational curses is undeniably the hardest thing you will ever do in your entire life because it requires you to stand completely alone against the people who are biologically supposed to protect you. When you finally decide to stand up for yourself and enforce ironclad boundaries, the pushback will be incredibly fierce. The people who heavily benefited from your endless lack of boundaries will fight incredibly dirty. They will try to completely destroy your character in front of your entire community. They will weaponize your shared history and try to isolate you to force you back into submission. They will call you crazy. They will call you bitter until they need your money. Protect your peace. Let them sit in the mess they made. It took me 33 years to realize that my fundamental worth was never dependent on their validation or their conditional love. I had to literally acquire a corporate skyscraper and burn down an entire law firm to finally understand my own absolute power. But you do not need to buy a massive corporate empire to take your personal power back right now today. You just need to confidently say no. You just need to walk away from the tables where mutual respect is no longer being actively served. You possess the absolute right to build a beautiful, fulfilling life entirely on your own terms, completely surrounded by people who genuinely celebrate you instead of barely tolerating you. You have the ultimate right to choose your own family, and I promise you that the beautiful peace is absolutely worth it. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members who thought they were smarter than you? How did you protect your peace? Drop your story in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, hit subscribe. Stay strong and never apologize for your success. Fades to black with upbeat, triumphant music. The narrative of Maya dismantling her family's illusion of power serves as a profound masterclass in recognizing one's own worth. The most crucial lesson learned from this saga is that a biological connection does not excuse toxic behavior, nor does it demand blind loyalty. For too long, societal and cultural norms have pressured individuals, especially successful women, to act as unconditional safety nets for their relatives. Maya's family expected her to absorb their endless insults, minimize her massive achievements, and ultimately take the fall for their fraudulent lifestyle simply because they shared a last name. However, Maya's ultimate victory was not just found in the corporate boardroom or in exposing her brother-in-law's multi-million-dollar embezzlement. Her true triumph occurred the moment she firmly established an unbreakable boundary with her enabling mother and manipulative father. She realized that her empire was built in spite of their emotional neglect, not because of their fabricated tough love. This teaches us that setting ironclad boundaries is an act of radical self-preservation and self-love. We do not owe our peace, our hard-earned resources, or our sanity to abusers who hide behind the title of family. We have the absolute right to define our own chosen family based on mutual respect, authentic love, and genuine support, rather than being anchored by generational trauma and endless guilt. True healing begins the exact moment we stop seeking validation from those who are committed to misunderstanding and exploiting us. When we let go of the heavy burden associated with cutting off toxicity, we make room for absolute unwavering peace in our lives. Take a moment today to evaluate the toxic relationships in your own life. Enforce your personal boundaries without apology, and protect your peace at all costs.